Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Democratic Television Channel. I'm Renee Hoyos, and tonight I'm going to host our program on the filibuster. The filibuster has been in the news lately. It's a bit complicated, and there's a couple of old-timey words used to describe it, but hopefully by the end of the show, you'll have a better idea of how it works. Before we get started, though, I'd like to give you a brief explanation of the filibuster before we launch into tonight's saga of political intrigue. So the filibuster, or the act of filibustering, has been used by senators from the beginning of our government. As you know, the Senate is the place for careful and studious debate, and debating an issue to death was commonplace in the early years of our government. Fairly early on, it was starting to be used to kill bills. One would talk for the entire time it took to consider a bill and leave no time to vote. So at the time, there was no way to stop these chatty dudes, and so bills would die for lack of a way to shut up a senator. So around the 1850s, it sort of became more formalized. Interestingly, the word filibuster comes from two different languages used to describe piracy on the Caribbean. The Dutch freebooter and the Spanish filibustos. I think it has more of a Spanish derivation, if you ask me. But then came the question, well, how do you stop this piracy of legislation? And that's where the word cloture comes in. If you substitute the T with the S, it makes a little bit more sense, at least to me. Closure of debate, and then you vote. So here's where it gets tricky. To use cloture to close the debate requires a 2/3 majority vote. And in that case, it's 60 votes. A better way to think about it might be that it only requires 40 votes to keep the gab going. So in other words, the minority can keep debating, it can run out the clock, and the bill doesn't get a vote. So it becomes easier to kill bills by talking them to death than to end the discussion and vote on them. Historically, it has been very difficult to end the filibuster. It's only been done a few times, and it was really enjoyed by Southern senators who wanted to kill civil rights and anti-lynching bills. Also, Senate rules have changed, and the filibuster has been given even more minority power. So tonight, the question will be, is giving the minority so much power really democracy? And to discuss these topics tonight, I have two guests I'd like to introduce. Our own John Stewart, former aide to Hubert Humphrey, and was present at one of the cloture votes that was successful, and Dr. Anthony Nouns, professor of political science at the University of Tennessee. Good evening, gentlemen. How are you tonight?
Hey, Renee.
Hello, great. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So as I mentioned in that brief opening, the filibuster has even changed since. It got that Spanish-derived word and cloture was created. I was wondering, Dr. Nouns, if you could tell us what's been going on in the world of the filibuster.
Oh boy, well, that's I'm not a historian. I want to preface my remarks by saying that I think, and though I'm not a young person, I can't really, I can only speak to the last 20, 30, 40 years. And I think as a political scientist, what we have to filibuster. It's something that up until the 80s or 90s, it was quite unusual to have anything out of the single digits. And in the last few years, it's exploded. And since the 90s, it's been well into triple digits. The other important thing to remember is that it's really not a filibuster anymore. What we're talking about is one senator, essentially, with a, like you say, relatively small group of his or her partisans being able to say, I'm going to threaten to filibuster, and that's usually enough to derail anything, because one of the things that we've learned about senators is they just want to go home. And many of them do on a weekly or monthly basis. And sticking around, even trying to break a filibuster, is just not something that they want to do. So, I think if we had to say anything has changed, it's the increased use of the filibuster, or the threat of a filibuster, that is the most obvious and important change.
So that's like, they're not even talking anymore. There's no more Mr. Smith goes to Washington, correct?
No, that just it's very very unusual and just does not happen anymore. And one of the things my my students generally ask me is, well, they ask two questions. One, what is the deal? Is this in the Constitution? No, the Senate just made it up, basically, and we could talk about it for hours, but they essentially make their own rules, and they decided it was something they wanted to have. And then the second question they ask is, well, who cares? And one of the things I say is, well, you should care, because this really isn't a Democrat or Republican or partisan issue. What it is an issue of is a small group, 40 out of 60 is a pretty, you know, it's not a huge number of senators, can pretty much stop a pretty large majority, 60%, from getting what they want. And, you know, the obvious rejoinder to that is that the founders created a counter-majoritarian government, and a government that was not designed to be democratic with a small d. And that's true. That there's not much in the original Constitution, especially, that's democratic with a small d. One of the ways you can see this is that the founders wrote a Constitution that you can't choose one entire branch of government, the judicial branch. You don't directly choose the president, the Electoral College does, and you don't directly choose senators under the original Constitution either. So you really had a one half of one branch of government that the people had a direct role in selecting. But that I don't really buy the argument that the Constitution was designed to function this way, or a government was designed to function this way, because the sheer accumulation of factors that are now in place to thwart Democratic or Republican majorities from working their will is so substantial that I think it's something to give. And I think filibuster is one of the more obvious things that doesn't make a lot of sense if you're talking about even a Republican government.
Yeah. Now we're very lucky tonight to have someone who was actually there. About how many times, John, has the filibuster been closed?
Like I don't know exact number, but it was back. I'm very old, so I was working in the Senate back in 1964 when there was this 60-day filibuster by the Southern Democrats trying to block the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And in those days, you needed to get 67 votes for closure. And I could go on for this half hour talking about all the things we did and why it worked and what it was, but no one's really interested in that. That was a long, long time ago. But there are some lessons, I think, that come out of that. And what's been described is the talking filibuster that we all think of in terms of Jimmy Stewart and so forth. That no longer exists, but it could exist if the senators made it exist. What happens now is any bill comes up and they don't have to get 50 votes to this bill. They now have to get 60 votes. So what used to be almost all bills in the Senate passed with a 51 vote majority. That is no longer the case. You're faced with this filibuster threat. And what has happened in recent years is that they have a test vote right up front. And so they have a quick test vote, and do 60 people then right up front vote to do away with the filibuster on that particular bill? And the answer almost always is no. And so then the Senate just simply moves on to something else. And it ends up as a way to seriously block all sorts of legislation, hundreds of bills. It is up into 300s now, when it used to be you'd have one or two filibusters maybe a year, if that. Now they're having these test votes and these 60 vote requirements all the time. And it has just raised holy hell with any serious legislating done. The Senate used to be called the world's greatest deliberative body. Now it's just a joke because of what has happened. So something has got to change. And I think we are in a moment when that is becoming a real possibility, because Senator McConnell just yesterday said that he was going to devote all of his time, 100% of his energy, to blocking everything that President Biden wants to do. And of course, he did that to President Obama, and it was fairly successful. So the Democrats are faced with a real test of will here. Can they amend Rule 22 in such a way that it will not prove to be a total roadblock to everything the Biden administration wants to do? That fight is looming, folks. It's going to happen. And so we're just sort of we could do this program probably 2 months from now, and we'd have a lot more to talk about, because we could well be in the middle of one of the great battles in the history of the U.S. Senate. So it's a good time to have a ringside seat. It has put tremendous focus on the filibuster, and there is something that is called the nuclear option. And I do not want to get into trying to discuss or explain the nuclear option, but it is a way that a simple majority of the Senate can change the Senate rules. And so the issue, in my mind, at this point anyway, is, are the Democrats prepared to unleash the nuclear option and try and rewrite the filibuster, the Rule 22, which is what governs cloture, in such a way that their entire legislative program is not blocked by Senator McConnell? So that's the question before the House, and it's a critical question, and it's going to be very interesting to see what the Democrats do. My hunch is Biden is not going to run from this fight, that he is going to. Meanwhile, just to stir the pot up a bit more, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is spending a lot of time trying to figure this out. And he's a smart guy, and there are a bunch of smart Democrats in the Democratic caucus, and they're focused on this as well. So it would only the fool would predict exactly what they might end up doing 3, 4, 5 weeks from now. Thank goodness the Democrats are not tearing themselves to shreds like the Republicans are in the House over whether or not people swear fealty to Trump's lie, the big lie about the election. The Democrats are focusing on legislation. They're focusing on Senate rules. They're trying to figure out how can we get around this roadblock that otherwise will effectively cancel out all the things that Biden has laid out and is laying out before the American people. So it's a time of high drama. And one more thing, and then I'll yield the floor. The thing that was really essential in '64, when we broke the Southern Democratic filibuster after 60 days, was public pressure from outside. It had become a moral question. Jim Crow could no longer be sustained as an element of American democracy. And so you had religious denominations, you had nuns and priests and stated clerks and individual members of congregations. You had all sorts of interest groups. You had civil rights groups. They were focused intently on getting this done. And with their pressure and with some great leadership from Senator Humphrey, a Democrat, and Senator Kuechel of California, a Republican, they got it done. And it was one of the great victories in the 20th century in terms of legislative accomplishments. So stay tuned, everybody. It's going to get really interesting. So,
well, I think, that's a real nod to public participation right there, that we all have to, call and talk to our senators and bug them, until our senators, I don't know,
But it's got to be, it's
I have
got
a
to,
lot of faith in our senators.
we somehow have to, not our senators,
Yeah.
somehow we've got to transform it into a moral question.
Mhm.
And the right to vote has that potential. And that's S1 bill, Senate Bill S1 is all about the right to vote, and it would effectively cancel all of these crazy things the Republicans are doing state by state in rewriting and writing restrictive voting procedures. So there's that. There's S4, which is the George Floyd legislation, which would rewrite and set national federal standards for policing, and those two bills have that potential of becoming moral issues, and that's what has to happen. And so we had delegations of churches coming in and making the rounds, and the church groups had a weekly meeting over in the Methodist building, which is right there on Capitol Hill, where they would plan out their strategy for the coming week. And so it was a well-orchestrated, serious effort to really mobilize the moral conscience of the American people. And that's got to have to happen again if the Democrats are going to be successful in doing something about the filibuster. So
that's right. Democracy with a small d.
I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. So a lot of folks are talking about ways to fix it, and S1, HB1, those are ways. Folks have been talking about, let's get rid of it. Biden has suggested making everybody talk instead of now, which is just threatening and then leaving. I'm curious, Professor Nouns, what you think should happen. Do you think we should fix it or just get rid of it? Or something else?
Well, for me, it's, it seems pretty silly. And again, as a non-historian, historical arguments don't really hold much weight for me about why it exists and the good it's done. I mean, but I don't think that's politically realistic. I don't Democrat or really the stomach to get rid of it. So I think these other measures are much more likely to succeed than getting rid of it altogether. If it was up to me, I would get rid of it. Certainly, forcing people to actually talk is a good start. I think. I think it would cut down on a lot of the nonsense, not all of it, but at least some of it.
Mm-hmm. John, what are your thoughts on the filibuster?
Well, it's very hard to know unless you're right in the middle of it, what the right strategy would be. In 64, we knew we had to make the Southern Democrats talk and make them hold the floor and talk. And they would divide themselves up into teams of 3. And so 3 Southern Democrats would be on the floor and they would be talking. And then, but the kicker to that was every now and then they would suggest the absence of a quorum, and there would be a quorum call. And at that point, since no other Southern Democrats would show up, the pro-civil rights forces, both Democrats and Republicans, had to be ready to answer that quorum call and keep the Senate in session. So we organized a very precise duty roster of senators who would be there. And we called their offices and we followed up with them, and they committed to be there. And over that 60-day period, I don't know how many quorum calls there were, but there were many, and we only missed one on a Saturday. And there was hell to pay when we missed it. We just, we let the senators who weren't there, who were supposed to be there, know it. And so, they were there next time. But that's all in the past. And what I'm saying is, I think Schumer, and working with the legislative people in the White House who are very good, and with Ron Klain, who was extremely good, the White House Chief of Staff. It's hard to know what they're going to come up with, but I think they're probably not going to repeal the filibuster outright, but I think they're going to find some exceptions that's going to permit the Biden program to go forward. And one thing that has been suggested is that you could rewrite Rule 22, that in terms of these quorum calls, make the people who are filibustering, those who are trying to block action, make them have 41 votes on the floor in answer to the quorum call. And that may sound easy, but it's not if these things happen at 2 a.m. So what you're doing is you're shifting the burden from those who are trying to kill the filibuster, which was where we were in 64. You would be shifting the burden to those who are conducting the filibuster in 2021. And that's a much heavier burden. And I think it opens up possibilities of working out compromises, of picking up a few Republican votes, Mitch McConnell notwithstanding. You would have to use the nuclear option probably to get that rules change, but I think that would have some attraction, because you wouldn't get rid of the filibuster. You would just make it harder for those who are filibustering to do it. And I think maybe you would. There are two key votes among the Democrats. The senator from West Virginia and the senator from Arizona are both moderate to conservative Democrats, and they're very uncertain about some of these things. In this approach, they could say we did not get rid of the filibuster, but we allowed the president's program to go forward, and that might be a formula that would work. But it's impossible for anybody on the outside, like we all are. And boy, I have been on the outside for many, many years to know exactly what the best path is. But I cannot believe that that Biden is just going to acquiesce to this silly test vote, 60 vote, kill the bill routine that McConnell pulls in back in 2009 and 2010. I don't think he will let that happen. He lived through that. It was a disaster. We're just getting started. It's going to get really interesting, folks, and it's worth paying attention to. I'm sure there are people who watching this show who could care less about the filibuster and have never thought about it whatsoever. But if they have any interest in the viability of American democracy, and presumably people ought to at least have some sense that American democracy counts, that it matters, they should be interested in this battle, because it is a battle that's going to have a big impact on American democracy. The Republicans have gone absolutely crazy. I mean, they're absolutely crazy. In the House, they're going to get rid of Liz Cheney, who is one of the few people who stands up and speaks the truth. I mean, Liz Cheney and I, in terms of policies, would agree on almost nothing. But she is a patriot, and she has integrity, and so all you can do is applaud her. I mean, it's a great portrait in courage. I mean, it's and in the long run, Liz Cheney is going to fare very well in this period. I mean, this thing.
Well, and John, one thing that I think there's two things I think Democrats have going for them. One, I think Democrats are extraordinarily lucky that the Republicans are busy doing nonsensical things like purging Cheney, as opposed to actually paying attention to real policy. No. I think this has allowed Biden to really fill the vacuum and also fill the airwaves with talk about things people actually care about. Number two, Biden, I'm a big fan of President Obama, but I think he was extraordinarily naive and continued to be naive throughout his entire presidency about his ability to get things done and bipartisanship, because he's sort of by nature a pretty reasonable guy. And I've been very impressed with Biden's approach to this, which is we're going to do it, or at least we're going to try to do it, and we're not going to deal with this nonsense. And I think those two things bode quite well for the Democrats actually being able to get some of this done, if not changing the filibuster rules. And it's also worth noting that he already got through the COVID-19 relief bill through the reconciliation process. And recently, you know, these rules are quite arcane and very difficult to understand, but the Senate parliamentarian is allowing them to do at least one more big thing through reconciliation, which is a way to bypass the filibuster. And, you know, Biden and the Democrats are going to take advantage of this.
Yeah, you bet
And
they are.
they're going to get, yeah, they're going big. And I think that's something that, frankly, Democrats should have been doing a long time ago. And it's good, I think, to see someone really understanding that that's the approach you have to take against the Republican Party as it is currently constituted.
I have believed for a long time that Biden has the capacity to be a really great president, and no one ever thought that was true. I mean, he didn't do well in the early primaries, and then thanks to Representative Jim Clyburn in South Carolina, the Biden campaign took off. But we are very lucky that he was the nominee, because he has the experience and the wisdom, and he's kind of old. I mean, he's younger than I am, but then everybody's younger than I am.
Also, you know, I think he's got the right temperament for the job. And if you combine temperament with, you know, a certain wisdom that comes with age, personally, I'm pleasantly surprised with what I've seen from him. And
yeah.
Again, I want to, you know, we don't have a ton of time left, but I don't know how many Republicans watch this show, but, you know, a lot of Americans, I don't know most, I can't say that anymore, have a strong sense of fairness. And the fact is that it really is true that one person from a state that might have 500,000 or 600,000 people in it can basically say no to a bill and it stops. That's the practical reality of the filibuster. And I think explaining that to a lot of people is not difficult. And I don't know if it would become the moral issue that civil rights was. I don't think it can be, and probably shouldn't be, but it is something that I think on the visceral level, most Americans can see, yeah, that's just not right. So I have at least a little bit of hope that something might change.
The other thing that Biden has got going for him, he has got really good people working for him. And boy, does that ever make a difference. I mean, really good people who know what they're doing, who've been there, who've done it, and who know their fields of specialization very well. And that really just look at what they've done with the vaccination process. I mean, they've just turned it around on a dime, and because they got competent people running it.
Yeah, imagine that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. We're out of time. I know we could talk about this, and you know, I feel really grateful that we have President Biden at the helm. I'm sorry that people want to compare him to other presidents. I think he is his own person, and we should acknowledge that. So,
I'll tell you what, Renee, even though you're going to be in Virginia, maybe in July or something, we can do another program after we've seen what's happened, and try and untangle that a little bit.
Yeah, I will definitely be available.
So stay tuned, everybody. This is just part one. We've got more to go.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
I hope so. All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.